You don't wake up weak. You become weak in the first 5 minutes after you open your eyes. The moment your hand reaches for your phone, your mind is no longer yours. A message you haven't replied to, a notification, a name lighting up your screen. And just like that, your state is decided by something outside of you. You haven't even left your bed, but you've already started reacting. This is how most people live their entire lives, not by choice, but by reflex. They think they lack discipline. They think they need motivation. They think they need a better environment. No. The problem is simpler than that and far more dangerous. It's the way you speak to yourself in the first moments of your day. One sentence in your mind can place you in calm or chaos, focus or distraction, control or submission. But most people never notice this. They let their inner voice run without structure, without discipline, without direction, and then they wonder why they feel drained so easily, why they get triggered so quickly, why they never feel fully in control of their own life. But that's only the surface. What's really happening is not a bad habit. It's that you've handed over leadership of your mind to a voice you've never trained. And once you understand this, everything you believe about discipline, motivation, and changing your life starts to collapse in a way that finally sets you free. Most people think their problem is what they do, but their real problem is who they are being when they do it. They focus on habits, they focus on routines, they focus on productivity systems, but they ignore the one thing that silently controls all of it, their identity. You don't act out of discipline, you act out of self-image. And every morning, before you've even spoken a word out loud, you reinforce that self-image through the way you speak to yourself. A reactive mind wakes up and immediately looks outward. What's happening? Who texted me? What do they think? What's waiting for me? It is constantly scanning for signals, constantly adjusting, constantly reacting. And without realizing it, it slowly erodes something deeper than productivity. It erodes self-respect. Because every time you let something external dictate your internal state, you are sending a message to yourself: I am not in control. And that message compounds. It shows up when you over-explain yourself in conversations. It shows up when you feel the urge to reply instantly just to not seem distant. It shows up when silence makes you uncomfortable, so you fill it with unnecessary words. Not because you have something meaningful to say, but because you don't feel grounded enough to hold your own presence. This is the difference between someone who is reactive, someone who is stoic. A reactive person is constantly negotiating with the outside world. They adjust their tone, their energy, their decisions based on what they receive. They are influenced before they even realize it. A stoic person operates differently. They start from within. They decide their state first, then they move through the world. From that state, not in response to it. They don't need constant feedback to stabilize themselves. They don't need validation to feel aligned. They carry their own center. And you can see it in the smallest moments, in the way they read a message and don't rush to reply, in the way they are misunderstood and don't feel the need to immediately correct it, in the way they sit in a room full of noise and remain untouched, not because they are numb, but because they are disciplined inside. But here's what most people don't want to admit. They are not reacting because they have to. They are reacting because they are afraid. Afraid of being ignored, afraid of losing control of how they are perceived. Afraid that if they don't respond, explain, or prove themselves, they will become invisible. And that fear quietly dictates their behavior. So they talk more than necessary. They explain things that didn't need explaining. They chase clarity from people who were never confused. They give energy to things that never deserved it. And every time they do that, they lower their own standard, not in one dramatic moment, but in small, repeated decisions that slowly reshape who they believe they are. This is why this is not a small issue. This is not about fixing your morning routine. This is about reclaiming your inner authority. Because once you lose that, everything else becomes fragile. Your focus becomes fragile. Your emotions become fragile. Your decisions become fragile. And you start living in a constant state of subtle instability where anything external can shift you. And the most dangerous part is you get used to it. You start calling it normal. You start thinking this is just how life feels. But it's not. It's what happens when your internal world has no clear leadership. And until that changes, no amount of discipline on the surface will hold. So before we go deeper, you need to understand this clearly. The way you speak to yourself is not just a reflection of your mindset. It is the command system of your life. And from this point forward, we're going to strip it down layer by layer until you see exactly where your power is leaking and how to take it back. The first shift is simple, but almost no one lives it. Nothing outside me decides my state. It sounds obvious, but most people don't believe it. They say they want control, but they give it away in seconds. A message comes in, their mood changes, a plan falls through, their energy drops, someone ignores them, their mind starts spinning, and they call that normal. It's not normal, it's dependency, disguised as awareness. Most people think being aware means paying attention to everything, what people say, what people do, what might happen next. But that's not awareness. That's exposure without control. And exposure without control will always lead to reaction. Take something small. You send a message, you see it's been read, no reply. Now watch what happens. Your mind starts filling the silence. Did I say something wrong? Are they ignoring me? Should I follow up? And just like that, your internal state is no longer yours. It belongs to a scenario you created inside your own head. Not reality, interpretation. This is where most people lose their power. Not in big moments, in these small, quiet ones, where nothing has actually happened, but they've already reacted. The Stoic sees this differently. They don't rush to assign meaning. They don't rush to react. They understand something most people ignore. External events are neutral. It is your judgment that gives them weight. And if you don't control that judgment, you will be controlled by it. So instead of reacting, they pause. Not dramatically, not to prove anything, but because they don't feel the need to move before they are clear. They let the moment exist without immediately trying to solve it. They let silence stay, silent. And in that space, they remain in control. This is not suppression. It's discipline. There is a difference. A reactive person feels something and immediately expresses it. A disciplined person feels something and decides what deserves expression. One is impulse, the other is power. And here's the part most people miss. When you react instantly, you're not being honest. You're being automatic. You're revealing a lack of control, not authenticity. Real control is being able to feel everything without needing to act on everything. That is strength. Not loud, not visible, but undeniable. And it shows up everywhere. In arguments, in relationships, in work. When someone challenges you, you don't rush to defend, you listen. When something goes wrong, you don't collapse. You adjust. When things don't go your way, you don't spiral. You stay steady because your state is not up for negotiation. And that's the shift. Nothing outside me decides my state. Not people, not outcomes, not timing, not opinions. If you understand this, everything begins to change. Because now, instead of trying to control the world, you start controlling your interpretation of it. And that is where your real power has always been. But most people never reach this point because they're too busy reacting to realize they've already lost control. And the longer that continues, the more natural it feels. Until one day, they don't even question it anymore. They just live inside reactions, thinking it's reality, but it's not. It's a loop. And the only way out is to stop letting the outside world write your internal script. Because the moment it does, you're no longer leading your life, you're following it. But here's where it gets deeper. Most people don't just react because they lack control. They react because they need something. And that need is what owns them. It's not the message that unsettles you. It's what the message represents. It's not the silence that bothers you. It's what you think that silence means. It's not the disagreement that triggers you. It's the feeling that you're being diminished, misunderstood, or not valued. And the moment your mind attaches meaning like that, you're no longer responding to reality. You're responding to a threat to your identity. That's why you over-explain. That's why you feel the urge to clarify your intentions. That's why you replay conversations in your head thinking of what you should have said. Not because the situation demanded it, but because your sense of self felt unstable. And when your identity feels unstable, you try to stabilize it externally. You try to fix how people see you. You try to correct their perception. You try to regain control of the narrative. But here's the truth, most people avoid. The more you try to control how you're perceived, the more you reveal that you are not in control of yourself. Real power is not in being understood, it's in being unmoved, even when you're not. And that's where most people break. They don't fear failure. They don't fear difficulty. They fear being seen the wrong way. They fear losing control over how others interpret them. So they react, they explain, they justify, they defend. And every time they do, they reinforce the same pattern. My state depends on how I am received. That is the quiet contract they sign with the world. And once you sign that contract, you are no longer free, because now your peace is conditional. Now your confidence is conditional. Now your sense of worth is conditional. It rises when people respond the way you want. It drops when they don't. And you end up living in a constant cycle of emotional negotiation, always adjusting, always checking, always trying to maintain a version of yourself that exists in other people's minds. And that is exhausting, not because life is hard, but because you've made your internal state dependent on external interpretation. The Stoic cuts this at the root. They don't try to control perception. They control alignment. They ask a different question, not how am I being seen, but am I acting in accordance with my standard? And that changes everything, because now your focus shifts from managing impressions to managing integrity. You stop chasing clarity from others. You start becoming clear within yourself. You stop needing immediate responses. You start trusting your own timing. You stop explaining unnecessarily. You start speaking only when it adds weight. And the silence that once felt uncomfortable becomes your advantage. Because now you're no longer using words to stabilize yourself. You're using restraint to strengthen yourself. And that restraint is visible. It shows up in the way you don't rush. It shows up in the way you don't chase. It shows up in the way you don't collapse when things feel uncertain. There's a certain calm in people like this, not passive, not distant, but grounded. And you can feel it even when they say nothing, because their state is not reacting to the room. The room is adjusting to them. But most people never reach this level because they're too busy protecting an image they don't even fully believe in. And as long as that continues, they will keep reacting, keep explaining, keep adjusting without ever realizing that the real problem was never the outside world. It was the fact that their identity was built on something that could be shaken. And until that changes, no amount of control on the surface will ever feel like enough. But once you see this clearly, you start to understand something most people miss. You don't need to control how things unfold. You need to stop needing them to unfold a certain way. And when that shift happens, your reactions begin to fade. Not because you force them to, but because you no longer have anything to defend. This is where most people get it wrong. They try to fix their reactions without ever questioning the identity those reactions come from. They think if they just stay calm, be more disciplined, or control their emotions, everything will change. But behavior does not create identity. Identity creates behavior. And if the identity is weak, the behavior will always collapse under pressure. You can force yourself to stay calm for a moment, but the moment something hits deeper, disrespect, rejection, uncertainty, you go right back to reacting. Not because you lack techniques, but because at your core, you still see yourself as someone who needs something from the outside. You need acknowledgement. You need clarity. You need to feel respected. And as long as you need those things, you will always be vulnerable to anything that threatens them. This is the root most people never reach. They don't lack control. They lack a stable sense of self. And without that, every situation becomes a test, every message becomes a signal, every delay becomes a question, every silence becomes a story, and your mind fills in the gaps, not with truth, but with insecurity. And here's the shift that changes everything. You stop asking, how? Should I act in this situation? And you start asking, who am I in this situation? Because a person with standards does not negotiate their behavior based on circumstances. They express their identity through it. If you see yourself as someone who needs validation, you will chase it. If you see yourself as someone who must be understood, you will explain. If you see yourself as someone who cannot lose control, you will react. But if you see yourself as someone who operates from self-respect, everything changes. You don't chase responses. You don't rush clarity. You don't fill silence. You don't overextend your energy. You don't perform to be accepted. You act in alignment with your standard, and that standard becomes your anchor, not the situation, not the outcome, not the opinion of others. This is why identity is everything. Not the version you show people, the version you believe when no one is watching, the version that speaks inside your head before you speak out loud. That voice reveals everything. It reveals what you tolerate. It reveals what you fear. It reveals what you think you deserve. And your behavior will always follow that line. You don't rise to your intentions, you fall to your identity. So if your identity is built on instability, your reactions will reflect that. You'll try to stay composed, but you'll leak energy. You'll try to stay quiet, but you'll feel the urge to speak. You'll try to stay grounded, but your mind will keep searching for confirmation, because deep down, you haven't changed who you believe you are. And this is where real power begins. Not when you control your actions, but when your actions no longer require control because they are natural to who you become. A person with standards does not need to remind themselves to stay calm. Calm is their baseline. A person with self-respect does not need to force boundaries. Their presence sets them. A person with inner authority does not need to prove anything. Their silence already communicates enough. And this is the part most people overlook. Your standards are not what you say they are. Your standards are what you tolerate. When you tolerate being ignored and still chase, when you tolerate being misunderstood and still over-explain, when you tolerate chaos and still react, you are training yourself into a weaker identity. Repetition becomes belief, belief becomes identity, identity becomes destiny. So the question is no longer, why do I react like this? The real question is, what version of myself have I been reinforcing every single day without realizing it? Because once you see that clearly, you can't unsee it. And from that moment on, every reaction becomes a choice. Every silence becomes a statement. Every action becomes a reflection of who you've decided to be. Not who you used to be, not who you hope to become, but who you are right now when it actually matters. At some point, this stops being about understanding and starts being about embodiment. Because knowing all of this means nothing if your behavior still leaks the same patterns. Real strength is not what you think. It's not intensity. It's not dominance. It's not saying more, doing more, proving more. Real strength is restraint. It's what you don't do. It's what you choose not to engage with. It's the ability to hold your ground without needing to announce it. And you can see it in the smallest, most ordinary moments. A notification lights up. You see it. You don't rush. You don't feel pulled. You decide when to engage. Not your impulses, not your curiosity. You. When someone says something that could trigger you, you don't interrupt. You don't correct immediately. You let them finish. You observe. You choose your response instead of reacting to theirs. And sometimes you don't respond at all. Not because you're avoiding, but because it doesn't deserve your energy. There is a difference. Most people cannot tell that difference. They think silence means weakness. They think if they don't respond, they lose. But the truth is, if you cannot stay silent when something doesn't deserve your response, you are not in control of your voice. And if you are not in control of your voice, you are not in control of your state. The Stoic understands this deeply. They treat their energy like a currency, not something to spend impulsively, but something to invest deliberately. They don't give reactions for free. They don't give explanations for free. They don't give access for free. Everything is filtered through one question. Does this align with who I am? And if the answer is no, they let it pass. This is what makes them different. Not because they are detached from life, but because they are selective with it. They can sit in a room where everyone is talking, reacting, interrupting, proving, and remain still. Not frozen, not disconnected, but grounded. They are present without being absorbed. They are aware without being pulled. And that presence has weight you don't have to hear. You can feel it. It's in the way they move slowly when others rush. It's in the way they pause before speaking. It's in the way they listen without needing to reply immediately. There is no urgency to prove. There is no pressure to fill space. There is no need to control how the moment is perceived. They are simply stable. And that stability is rare because most people are constantly leaking energy. They check their phone without intention. They respond before thinking. They speak to release tension, not to add value. They try to resolve discomfort immediately instead of holding it. And every time they do that, they weaken their own center, not dramatically, but consistently. It's subtle, it's quiet, but it compounds. And over time, they become someone who cannot sit still with their own thoughts, someone who cannot tolerate silence, someone who needs constant input just to feel normal. That is not strength, that is dependence, disguised as activity. So embodiment begins here, not in big, visible actions, but in small, controlled moments. You don't reach for the phone immediately. You don't reply the second you see a message. You don't explain when it's not necessary. You don't react just because something is said. You pause, you choose, you act with intention, and slowly your behavior starts to reflect something different. Not effort, not force, but control. And the more you live like this, the more natural it becomes. You stop fighting impulses because they stop dominating you. You stop trying to stay calm because calm becomes your default. And people notice, not because you're trying to be different, but because you no longer behave like everyone else in moments where most people lose themselves, where others rush, you remain, where others react, you observe, where others speak, you choose silence. And in that silence, there is power. Not loud, not performative, but undeniable. Because when your presence no longer depends on constant action, your stillness begins to carry weight. And that is something most people will never understand until they feel it. And this is where it all expands beyond daily behavior into something much bigger. Because at a certain point, this is no longer about messages, reactions, or even discipline. It becomes about how you choose to live your life at its core. Most people live in a constant state of negotiation, not just with others, but with reality itself. They want things to happen a certain way. They want people to respond a certain way. They want life to feel a certain way. And when it doesn't, they resist. They tense up. They react. They try to force alignment between reality and their expectations. And that tension is what exhausts them, not life itself, but their refusal to accept what is happening without immediately trying to control it. This is why they never feel at peace, because their peace is always conditional. It depends on timing. It depends on outcomes. It depends on other people behaving the way they hoped. And as long as peace depends on something outside of you, it will always be unstable. The Stoic understands something most people spend their entire lives avoiding. You don't control events. You don't control timing. You don't control how others think, act, or respond. And the more you try to, the more you suffer. Not because life is against you, but because you are trying to dominate what was never yours to control. So they make a different decision. They stop trying to control everything outside, and they master what is inside. They don't resist reality, they align with it. They don't demand that things go their way. They prepare themselves to remain steady no matter how things go. And that shift is everything, because now, instead of fighting life, you move with it. Instead of reacting to every change, you remain grounded through it. Instead of attaching your state to outcomes, you anchor it in something deeper, your standards, your values, your way of being. And that creates a different kind of strength. Not the kind that needs to win every situation, not the kind that needs to be right, not the kind that needs to be seen or validated, but the kind that remains intact even when things don't go your way, even when people misunderstand you, even when you don't get the outcome you wanted. There is no collapse. There is no panic. There is no need to rush and fix everything immediately. There is only adjustment, clarity, movement forward. This is what it means to choose dignity over impulse, to choose long-term self-respect over short-term emotional relief, to choose peace over performance. And most people never reach this level because they are addicted to control, not real control. Control over outcomes, control over perception, control over how things unfold. But real control is quieter than that. It doesn't try to shape the world, it shapes the self. And from that place, everything changes. You stop measuring your day by what happened, you start measuring it by how you showed up. You stop asking, did things go my way? And you start asking, did I stay aligned with who I am? Because in the end, that's the only thing that compounds. Outcomes change, people change, circumstances shift, but the way you carry yourself, that becomes your identity, and your identity becomes your life. So every morning becomes a decision, not about what you will achieve, not about what you will get from the world, but about who you will be within it. Will you be reactive or composed, dependent or self-contained, unstable or grounded? Because time will pass either way. Life will move either way. The only question is, will you spend it chasing control over things you were never meant to control? Or will you finally take control over the only thing that was ever yours, yourself? But here's the part most people never question. What if the version of strength you've been trying to build isn't strength at all? What if it's just another form of reaction disguised as control? Because not all silence is power. Sometimes silence is avoidance. Not all calm is discipline. Sometimes calm is suppression. Not all detachment is wisdom. Sometimes detachment is fear dressed up as philosophy. This is where the illusion breaks. Most people hear about Stoicism and they turn it into armor. They stop expressing. They shut things down. They convince themselves they don't care. They withdraw. They become distant. And they call that strength. But look closer. That's not control. That's protection. That's what happens when someone is overwhelmed but doesn't know how to process it. So instead of reacting outwardly, they retreat inwardly. They don't solve the chaos, they just hide it. And over time, that hidden tension builds. It shows up in subtle ways, in the way they disconnect from people, in the way they avoid difficult conversations, in the way they suppress emotions instead of understanding them. They look calm on the surface, but inside, nothing is actually stable. That's not Stoicism. That's escape. Real Stoic strength is not about shutting down. It's about staying open without losing control. It's about feeling everything fully without becoming it. It's about being present with discomfort without needing to run from it or react to it. Avoidance says, I don't want to deal with this. Suppression says, I won't let this show. But discipline says, I see this clearly, and I choose how to respond. That's the difference. One avoids, one hides, one leads, and most people cycle between the first two. They either react impulsively or they withdraw completely. They swing between expression and suppression, never realizing that both are forms of losing control. One gives energy away, the other locks energy inside. But neither is mastery. Mastery is quieter than both. It doesn't need to prove detachment. It doesn't need to perform calm. It doesn't need to convince anyone. It simply is. And you can feel the difference immediately. When someone is truly grounded, there's no tension in their silence. There's no pressure behind their calm. There is no distance in their presence. They are fully there without being affected. They can engage without losing themselves. They can step back without disconnecting. They can speak without needing to dominate. And they can stay silent without feeling small. That is real control. Not controlling what you feel, but controlling what you do with what you feel. And this is the deeper turn most people never reach because it requires honesty. It requires you to look at yourself and ask, am I actually in control? Or am I just reacting in a more socially acceptable way? Am I calm, or am I just avoiding conflict? Am I silent, or am I just afraid to speak? Am I detached, or am I just tired of being hurt? Because if your strength is built on avoidance, it will collapse the moment something real confronts you. But if your strength is built on clarity, on awareness, on conscious choice, then nothing can shake it. Not because life becomes easy, but because you are no longer lying to yourself about where you actually stand. And once you reach that level of honesty, everything sharpens. Your actions become cleaner, your words become fewer, your presence becomes heavier. Not because you're trying to be powerful, but because there is nothing fake left to maintain. And that is where real Stoicism begins. Not in controlling appearances, not in escaping discomfort, but in standing fully inside yourself without needing to move, react, or hide. So in the end, this was never about 5 words. It was never about a morning routine. It was never about saying the right things just to feel better for a moment. This was about something much deeper. Who is in control when your day begins? Because the truth is, your life is not shaped in big, dramatic moments. It is shaped in small, repeated decisions that most people don't even notice. The moment you wake up, the moment you check your phone, the moment something pulls your attention, the moment you feel the urge to react. These are the moments where your identity is either reinforced or rewritten. Not once, but daily. Not loudly, but consistently. And over time, that consistency becomes who you are. Most people never take control of these moments. They let their mind drift. They let their emotions lead. They let the outside world set the tone. And then they spend the rest of the day trying to recover, trying to focus, trying to stay calm, trying to feel in control. But you can't fix a day that was already surrendered at the start. You can't reclaim control later if you gave it away at the beginning. And that's why this matters. Because when you take control of the first voice in your head, you take control of everything that follows. You don't wake up and hope for a good day. You decide the standard of your day. You don't wait to see how you feel. You define how you operate. You don't react to what comes. You meet it from a position that is already set. And that position is built through something simple but powerful. The words you allow inside your mind, not soft words, not empty affirmations, but precise, deliberate commands. Words that remind you who you are. Words that cut through noise. Words that anchor you before anything external has a chance to move you. Because if you don't define your internal voice, something else will. And it will not ask for permission. It will come from notifications, from other people's expectations, from fear, from habit, from everything except your own intention. And slowly, without realizing it, you will start living a life that feels slightly off. Not broken, not dramatic, but misaligned. And that misalignment will follow you into everything. Your work, your relationships, your decisions, your sense of self. And the dangerous part is you can live like that for years, functional, competent, but never fully in control, never fully grounded, never fully yourself. Or you can make a different choice. You can decide that from this point forward, your mind is not a place where anything is allowed to speak freely. It is a place that is trained. It is a place that is led. It is a place where every thought either serves your standard or gets dismissed. And that starts in the morning, not with action, not with movement, but with awareness, with intention, with control over the first thing that shapes your state. Because once you win that moment, everything else becomes easier. Not easy, but clearer, more stable, more aligned. And from that place, you stop chasing control over life. You start embodying control within yourself. And that changes everything. So tomorrow morning, before you reach for your phone, before you react, before the world enters your mind, pause, listen, and ask yourself one question: who speaks first today? Because whatever that voice is, that is what will shape your life.